Slay the Spire is a game about deck building. It uses turn-based battles and a roguelike structure to create a PvE card game that is surprisingly deep, where players constantly need to make carefully thought out decisions, to balance risk and reward, and to look at both their current and future needs in order to build a winning deck. This results in a game that is highly skill-based and can be very strategically satisfying, and it's also a great example of a game which is easy to learn and hard to master. You start each run by choosing from one of 3 characters and then picking a small starting bonus. From here, you'll progress along a randomly generated branching map that displays the type of encounter each room features. Normal encounters provide okay rewards but can chip away at your health. Elites are higher risk and higher reward, shops and camps offer special services that can be very useful but are also situational, and random events are more dependent on RNG. So the first element of decision making comes with choosing your route through the dungeon. But it's when choosing which cards to add to your deck where things get really interesting. You'll start each run with a small deck of weak, basic cards, and then after each fight you get to choose from 3 cards which one, if any, you want to add to your deck. Not all cards are equal, but comparing their value is not a simple task. Some cards have great synergies but are weak without other supporting cards. Some cards have great potential later in the run, but may offer little to help you currently, and others might be weak in the grand scheme of things, but can provide vital early game boosts of power that you won't survive without. Choosing the right cards feels like part art and part science, but it's the addition of relics which makes building a deck get really complicated. Relics are rewards from various encounters, and each one applies a specific passive bonus. They give you small buffs or modifiers that can give you an advantage, and as you climb higher up the spire you'll get more and more of them. Towards the end of your run you'll have about 10 to 20, each giving their own bonus, and with 161 different relics in the game that means there's a huge amount of combinations and different synergies between relics and cards that can lead to some insanely powerful combos. The right relics can completely change how the game plays by adding things like the ability to preserve energy or cards between turns. And there's still more to consider when building a deck. You also have the ability to upgrade cards at camps, as well as to remove cards at shops to allow you to draw your strong cards more often. And so all these factors combine to produce lots of variables, which gives deck building a lot of depth and makes you need to consider each choice carefully. But despite this, it's still not a hard game to get into. Building a good deck might be complex, but the process is broken down so you only choose one card at a time, which makes it manageable even for players unfamiliar with card games. What's more, your deck starts off so simple that combat is easy to learn. Your starter deck is comprised mostly of 1 energy cards that either attack or block. This means the only thing you need to decide in combat is how much energy to spend on each option. You'll soon realise that health is a precious resource, as opportunities to heal are limited, and this means that each combat encounter is a challenge to preserve as much health as possible. So knowing this, you might try to play as defensively as you can, and if you do this you'll soon come to understand that this approach can be counterproductive, as it can lead to fights lasting longer, which can mean more overall damage gets taken. Some early game enemies even scale in power the longer the fight goes on, just to hammer this point home. In Slay the Spire, the best defense is often a strong offense, and sometimes you have to sacrifice some health early on in a fight to finish it quicker. This concept is vital to understand in order to be successful, and because the game starts out with the player using a basic deck, it's also made easy to understand. There are lots of aspects like this, from learning individual boss strategies to understanding which cards should be chosen and when. There's a strong sense of progression as you learn about the game and get more experienced at building a deck and making the right choices. This feeling of progression is something that is hugely important for a roguelike. In order for failed runs to not feel pointless, players need to feel like they are improving at the game, but the knowledge they get from each unsuccessful run will help them to be more successful in the future. And at least early on, Slay the Spire might do this better than any other roguelike I've played. Failed runs really do feel like a learning experience, and you can often pinpoint where they went wrong, whether from a single moment of greed or a general failure to prioritise something you needed. Still, there is a lot of RNG involved. That should be pretty obvious, as RNG is a big part of both card games and roguelikes, but it still seems worth stating and expanding upon. You have little choice in what relics you acquire, and relics are important. You can also draw bad cards, which would usually be your own fault later on in a run, but can still be pretty impactful early on. And then there's also random events, which can lead to bad outcomes. Despite this, I'd still describe Slay the Spire as a game that gets RNG right. And this is because of a few clever decisions that limits the impact of RNG and makes the game rarely feel frustrating. The first of these is by telegraphing enemy attacks so that you don't have to guess what the enemy will do. By removing that guesswork, it means players understand what's coming in combat, and so you never feel like you're punished for guessing wrong. Instead, you can think about the best way to use your available resources, and even if you lose, you know it will be because your deck wasn't good enough rather than because you gambled on a 50-50 of whether the enemy would attack or block. The second thing that limits RNG is how your deck scales throughout a run. Early game choices are important early on, but their impact is lessened the further into a run you get. For example, later card choices offer better cards, so even if you get some bad options at the start of your run, you'll know that you can easily bounce back if you can just keep on surviving, and so the urge to abandon a run early on due to bad luck is very rare. The final thing that limits the frustration of RNG is to do with frequency and impact. RNG is very frequent in Slay the Spire, but each individual roll of a dice isn't very impactful. Getting one bad selection of cards doesn't feel like it matters much in the long run. One useless relic might be a small disappointment, but it's not a big deal when you know you're going to end up with 15 plus other relics. Because RNG plays a role so often, it feels like bad RNG is just something which will be balanced out. The only real exception to this is boss relics, which are pretty important, but that shouldn't be enough to frustrate players. On one condition. In Slay the Spire, if you want to do well consistently, you have to learn to go with the flow. Because you only have limited control over which cards and relics you get, you need to be able to adapt to the choices you're given and work with what you've got. This is completely different to deck building in a PvP card game where you get to design the perfect deck and have complete control. You may go into a run of Slay the Spire with the intent to make a certain type of deck, say a poison deck on the silent, and then find you don't get enough of the cards you need. You may then feel like the game is punishing you, which it sort of is. It's punishing you for not being adaptable because that's a part of the game. So it's fair for the game to do this, but for certain players being forced to adapt might not be fun when they just want to play a certain type of deck. The last thing I'll say on the topic of RNG is that outside of higher difficulties, experienced players are able to win with a 100% win rate. This is because skill is very important, and high skill can make up for bad RNG. There are certain ways the game could further reduce RNG, like giving you more freedom with relic choices. But this could easily lower the skill ceiling by giving players too much control and reducing the need to be adaptable, and that would be a shame because rewarding skilled play is one of the things that makes Slay the Spire stand out. The base game has 3 acts that each end with a boss fight, and a successful run would take around 1 hour. Completing the 3rd act on each of the 3 characters is quite easy. It will probably take around 10 hours for the average new player, but that isn't the end of the game. It's more like completing the tutorial. After you've done this, a final act opens up which adds in an extra boss, and also Ascension mode becomes available. Ascension mode is an interesting way of handling difficulty. Each rank of Ascension adds a challenge modifier to a run that makes it a little harder. On Ascension 1 you only have the first modifier, and then each level of Ascension you go up will add 1 extra modifier. The great thing about this is that difficulty increases very gradually. If you look at the full list of modifiers it might look impossible, but when you take them one at a time they always seem manageable. When you complete each run of Ascension you can look at exactly what new modifier has been added and you'll always feel like it's still doable. After all, if you could complete the game with all the previous modifiers, surely one more little addition won't stop you. And so the steady increase in challenge creates a satisfying difficulty curve, and the objective of beating each rank of Ascension adds a lot to Slay the Spire's lifespan. Outside of Ascension there's also daily challenges which add several interesting modifiers to a normal run and can be pretty entertaining. I never knew playing a barricade demon form silent would be so fun, but hey, it was. There's also a custom mode which also includes an endless option, and there's also an active modding scene which can add new characters and new modes that feel surprisingly well made and balanced. So Slay the Spire has a good amount of content with several well made gameplay modes that give you reasons to keep playing, which is good because outside of gameplay this game has almost nothing to offer. There isn't really any story. I mean, there's this Spire thing, which I guess is bad, although I'm not sure why. There's also this whale dude, and he seems pretty chill. He doesn't talk much though. And that's about it. And that's fine, this is a game you play for the gameplay. Just don't expect any interesting lore or plot. The artwork looks passable but also feels a little uninspired and generic. There's something slightly disappointing about getting to the final boss of Act 3, and it's just 2 shapes? And to be honest, they're not even very interesting shapes. Animations are also pretty basic, but at least they trigger quickly and don't stop you from playing cards as fast as you want to. The only other big criticism I have with the game is that Ascension modes and Act 4 feel at odds with each other. To progress to higher Ascension levels, you only have to beat Act 3. Not only that, but to unlock Act 4 in each run, you have to find 3 key pieces, which makes the game more challenging. And so if your objective is to climb Ascension ranks, there's no incentive to defeat Act 4 in the process. This is a bit of a shame because there have been times when finishing a run on Ascension that I've really wanted to take my deck further and see if it's good enough to beat the final act. But because I've been focused on winning on Ascension, I haven't went out of my way to get all the key pieces in time, and so I can't. It also makes Act 4 feel very insignificant in general, as there's no real reward to beating it. This is the result of early access development where Ascension was added before Act 4, so I understand why things are this way, but it's still a bit disappointing that now the game has been fully released, Act 4 still feels like a bit of a pointless add-on. There's also some balance problems, as you'd probably expect. It's fine that some cards are better than others, but some whole archetypes just feel unviable at high Ascension levels, which is a bit more of a problem. I also have a few nitpicks about some design choices. Like, in events, why don't they say exactly what relic you'll receive, if they always give you the same relic? There's no reason not to just give players this information when they're making a choice. Being hidden adds nothing and just forces players to memorize or Google these events, which should be unnecessary. Still, overall Slay the Spire feels like a game where the devs know exactly what makes deck building fun, and it does a great job at combining roguelike and card game elements together to make for a very rewarding and enjoyable experience. Slay the Spire executes its vision really well, and maybe that shouldn't be surprising considering the developers took their inspiration from the card game Dominion, and the roguelike elements seem to fit perfectly in retrospect. But it's still great to see a PvE card game be so successful, because it's a genre that's been fairly unrepresented in video games despite the rise of several online card games. PvE card games remove a lot of the negative features of their PvP counterparts, like excessive grinding, pay-to-win elements, and hard to keep up with metas. But what's really surprising about Slay the Spire is that it still feels like it can compete with other card games in terms of depth, and mastering the Spire makes for a real challenge. If you're a fan of card games or roguelikes, or just someone that likes games that are highly skill based and require players to think a lot, you should check Slay the Spire out.